Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with my April reading wrap-up. So, I read 7 things in the month of April, which sounds like a lot, but really 3 of them were novellas. I was reading the 3 novellas that were shortlisted for the BookTube SFF Awards. I do have a reading vlog of me reading specifically those 3 novellas. If you're interested, I will link that below. I also have been doing constant reading vlogs, so I do have reading vlogs where I talk more in depth about these books. So if you're interested in more thoughts or you want to see my reading journey as I was reading these books, definitely check out those reading vlogs, which will be linked down below. Anyways, while 7 things sounds like a lot, like I said, 3 of them were novellas. I think that those 3 novellas combined kind of equal 1 book page number wise, so I guess maybe I read kind of 5 books, which is still an improvement over the 4 books that I've read every month in 2020 so far. So I do think I'm getting back into my reading groove a little bit. As far as quality, I would say that I had a pretty good quality month. This is how my ratings panned out for the month, and the only thing that disappoints me is that I didn't have any 5-star reads. I almost always have at least 1 5-star a month, but while I enjoyed a lot of what I read in April, hence so many 4 stars, I didn't have anything that I head over heels loved and thought was perfect. But I'm definitely happy with the number of 4-star reads that I had in April. And as you guys know, I am trying to read mostly books from series this year, and I would say that April was pretty good for that. Other than the 3 novellas that I read, everything that I read was part of a series, which is 4 books. The books that I read this month were Ruthless Gods by Emily A. Duncan, the 2nd book in the Wicked Saints series, The Cool Prince by Holly Black, which is the 1st book in the Folk of the Air series, To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers, The Test by Sylvain Neuvel, This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal, El-Mohtar, and Max Gladstone, The Wicked King by Holly Black, which is the 2nd book in the Folk of the Air series, and one of the BookTube SFF YA nominees. And lastly, the Book of Koli by M.R. Carey, which is the 1st book in the Rampart trilogy. I will have timestamps in the description box for where I talk about these books in case you're only interested in hearing my thoughts on some of them. And also, I'll have the vlogs where I talked about these books linked down below as well. Okay, so let's get into the books. The 1st book that I finished, actually, now that I think about it, I have a physical copy of this. The 1st book I finished in April was Ruthless Gods by Emily A. Duncan. I did receive an advanced reader copy of this from BookNet Fest when I went last fall. So thank you to the publishers for a free copy in exchange for an honest review. I also do have a standalone review for this, and I'm giving away my copy of this arc, so if you're interested in my review or in winning the giveaway, definitely check out my review video, which will be linked for you. So this is the sequel to Wicked Saints. The series is called Something Dark and Holy. This is a YA fantasy, a pretty dark fantasy that I read physically, obviously. This world is a Russian-inspired fantasy, and in some ways has some similarities with the Grisha series by Leigh Bardugo, the trilogy in particular. People had mentioned that, I think, even with the 1st book, but at that point I had really only seen the world inspiration being similar between the 2 because they're both Russian-inspired. But in this one, I kind of drew some similarities with some of the characters from that series as well. I think this series will be really appealing to people who are a fan of the Darkling from that trilogy. I also want to mention that the type of magic, or there's 2 types of magic in this world, but one of them is blood magic, where you have to cut yourself to be able to perform the magic. So there's a lot of cutting and a lot of blood, and this book in particular, I feel like more than the 1st one, kind of leans horror. In addition to all of the blood everywhere, there were some descriptions of things that were very horror-y, and I think that's one of the reasons why I enjoyed this. One of the things that I didn't love about this book, but also didn't ruin my enjoyment of it at all, is that this series is a little more angsty and melodramatic than I really prefer. If I had my way, that stuff would have been toned down just a little bit, but I think that a lot of people will enjoy the angstiness of the romance and other things in this book. One of the main characters is named Nadia, and I didn't love her in the 1st book. I thought she was kind of annoying, and that remains to be true in this book. She has some, conflicting feelings about people in this book, and I felt like she was doing things that didn't align with her feelings and how she thought about stuff, but it was also very much on purpose because the character would reflect on that, how her actions weren't aligning with what she wanted to happen. So she's kind of making some dumb choices that I didn't love, but still made for an interesting story. My favorite character from the last book was Seraphim, the prince, and he continues to be my favorite. I really enjoyed his storyline in this book, and I'm concerned for him. And then the other main character, Malakiash, I believe is how you say the name. He did not, as far as I remember, get a point of view in the first book, but he does get a few chapters. Actually, they're not even called chapters, they're like interludes. But you see from his point of view a few times in this book, which I thought was helpful to kind of get a better grasp of what's going on in his head. I did think the pacing was a little bit off. The beginning was kind of slow for me, which is surprising because the first book, the beginning was a little too fast for me. I do think it was a little bit longer than it needed to be, but I still really enjoyed the story, and I'm very much looking forward to the next book, which I think is the last book in the series. The next book that I finished in April was The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This is the first book in the Folk of the Air series. I've read this primarily on audiobook, which I got through my library, and I think the narrator for the series is fantastic. I really enjoyed her narration. This is a YA fantasy about a girl named Jude and her sisters. When she's really young, her parents are murdered by one of the fairies, and then that fairy takes in her and her sisters and raises them in the fairy world. So Jude grows up in the fairy world, but she is 100% human. One thing I really enjoyed about this book was the fairy world. I have read a couple of Holly Black's books before, one of them which is actually set in this fairy world. There is a callback to that book in this one, and or maybe it's in the second one. I don't, because at this point I've read the sequel to this. I don't remember which, but I do know that they are set in the same world, which I thought was really cool. But yeah, I really like the take on fairies in this book. They're the kind of fairies who can tell no lies, but they kind of are tricky with their words, so they can say things that might not necessarily mean what it sounds like they mean. One thing I was really nervous about going into this book was the romance in the series. I knew was like an enemies to lovers sort of thing, and that just is a trope that often doesn't work for me, and so I was really nervous about that, but I actually ended up really enjoying the romance in this book, and I really like the character Jude. I wasn't sure what I thought of her at first, because she is a little bit like rash, which is not a characteristic I really enjoy from my main characters. I prefer main characters that are more like methodical and really think things out and are a little more careful than maybe she is, but she really grew on me, even though she's rash and does things without necessarily thinking them through. I don't know, I really liked her as a character and the dynamics that she has with her siblings. I thought this book was a lot of fun. It didn't have any like pacing issues or anything for me. I don't have a whole lot more to say about it. I can't really pinpoint what's keeping me from a 5-star on this one because I did really enjoy it, but it just didn't give me that 5-star feeling. But I'm really grateful for the BookTube SFF Awards pushing me to read this sooner rather than later. The next few things that I read were the 3 novellas for the BookTube SFF Awards. Like I said, I did do a reading vlog, which will be linked for you if you want to see my experience reading these novellas. I did have a lot of fun putting that video together. The first one that I read and finished was To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. The glare, I'm so sorry. I did actually mostly listen to this on audiobook, which I got through Hoopla or Scribd. I don't quite remember where I got the audiobook, but I had the audiobook that I listened to, some of while I was physically reading and some while I was working on a puzzle. I had never read any Becky Chambers before. I've heard a lot about her other series, and I definitely want to read it, and I think this was a great way to be introduced to her writing, because the things that I heard about her books, I definitely saw in this short little novella. It is 138 pages. So one thing that Becky Chambers is known for are her characters, and I loved the characters in this book. Not only did I love the characters, but I just love the little family that they created, which is something people talk about in her other books as well. Her books tend to be more character-focused rather than plot-driven, and that also held true for this book. The ending of the novella, I think, is something that some people like and some people don't. I fell, surprisingly, on the side of liking it. I can be a little picky about endings sometimes, but I actually was okay with this one. I can't say that I loved it. I think there's a different way it could have ended that I would have preferred, but I also don't find it quite as disappointing as some other people who have read this book. One thing that I loved about this book is that she really explores some scientific questions. I love the science. I guess I didn't really talk about what this is about. I don't want to say too much because it's so short, but this is about 4 scientist astronauts who have been sent to these outlying planets to search for life forms and things. And I love the scientific ideas explored and imagining what different life forms could look like on other planets. But on top of that, this book really examines some of the ethical dilemmas when it comes to space travel and exploring new planets that I hadn't really considered. Like, how do you study something in its environment without impacting that environment and without like leaving, you know, a trace that humans had been there? That was like really interesting. And then also the way that it ends, to me, I interpreted it as it was posing kind of like a scientific question that I, as a scientist, really enjoyed like thinking about. And so because I found the ending so thought-provoking is why I didn't find it quite as disappointing as I think some other people have, but it is an ending that seems a bit polarizing. The next novella that I read was The Test by Sylvain Neuvel. This one is quite short, like 100 pages. And this one really surprised me. I had heard what it was about. It's about a guy taking an immigration test, and I just heard it was like a sci-fi dystopian-y kind of setting. And while I love dystopians, I just didn't think that plot sounded really all that interesting. But this one actually, spoiler alert, ended up being my favorite of the 3 novellas. I did also listen to this on audiobook, which I got, I think, on Scribd. I definitely don't want to say more about the plot than what I just did, but this one really surprised me. It's kind of action-y and also thought-provoking, especially the way that it ends, and it kind of caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting it to be much, and it was a lot more than I was expecting to get. I had a lot of fun reading this, and I'm definitely interested in checking out Sylvain Neuvel's other books. I know he has a trilogy that I've heard good things about, but I haven't picked up yet, and now I'm more interested than ever. And then the last novella that I picked up for the BookTube SFF Awards was the one that I was most excited about, and it ended up being a huge disappointment for me, and that was This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal, El-Mohtar, and Max Gladstone. Oh gosh. So I have been super excited about reading this book. It came onto my radar when I started watching some Best of the Year videos at the end of 2019 and early 2020. People were putting this on their Best of the Year list, and it's something that I hadn't heard of. And when they told me what it was about, or, you know, said in their video what it was about, they didn't tell me specifically, I was really intrigued. So this has been discussed or pitched as like time-traveling assassins or time-traveling spies who are like pen pals that fall in love. And I would say the description is pretty accurate, except that the writing style of this is not what I was looking for or what I enjoy reading. This is definitely leans literary fiction with the writing style. It has beautiful prose, and that's what people talk about, right? They say that the writing was so beautiful, and I don't disagree with that. My personal preference, even when something has really beautiful writing, I have to be able to understand what they're saying. Like, to me, this book was so beautiful prose-y that I had no idea what was happening. A lot of the writing and descriptions are very like abstract and nebulous, and that's not the type of writing that I like. I liked more concrete writing where you're actually describing what is physically happening, and not something that like when I read I can't even picture what they're saying. And there was so much stuff about like the time travel and how they were getting the letters to each other that just I plain did not understand. If I hadn't been reading this for the BookTube SFF Awards, I would have 100% have DNF'd it maybe halfway through, because I knew pretty quickly that I wasn't going to understand what was happening. This is one of those books that I mean, I would like to say that I see why people like it, but to me, I just don't get it. I feel like this is over my head. But I also think it has to do with, you know, what I enjoy about a book, and I enjoy knowing what is happening in it. I feel so mean saying that, because obviously people want to know what's happening in the book, but I think maybe that's something that you know, some people value more than others, and just like the idea of the story and the beautiful writing is enough for some people for them to love it. But for me, there was just so much that I didn't understand, and I had so many questions that the whole book I was just dealing with being the whole book. It's not that long. The whole time I was just constantly like confused, and it really impeded my enjoyment of this novella. Okay, 2 more things. The next book that I finished in the month of April was The Wicked King by Holly Black. This is the second book in the Folk of the Air trilogy. This is the one that was actually on the BookTube SFF Awards shortlist for the YA category. I did primarily listen to this on audiobook, which I got from my library, and I also had an ebook copy that I also got from my library. Like I said, I highly recommend these books on audiobook. I really enjoy this narrator. I was really excited going into the sequel because The Cruel Prince had surprised me so much, just because I wasn't expecting to enjoy the romance. So I was really excited to continue on in the series and see where the story goes from there. But boy, was I not expecting to enjoy this book as much as I did. The romance definitely grew on me even more in this installment in the series, and it was really cool to see Jude in the position that she's in this book. There was so much political intrigue in this book that I was not expecting. That was probably my favorite part about this. That is, until you get to the ending. The ending surprised me. I was not expecting it. Maybe I'm kind of dumb, but I really enjoyed the way that this ended, and I am dying to read the next book. I have the ebook on hold from my library. I'm actually very bummed my library does not have the audiobook for Queen of Nothing, because I would love to listen to this, but I can't seem to access the audiobook anywhere except to buy it, and I don't think I'm going to buy it. Instead, I'm just gonna have to be reading the ebook only, which is totally fine. But I love this narrator so much. I have heard that people say the last book was a little disappointing, and so I'm kind of nervous about that, but I'm still excited to read it. I really enjoyed The Wicked King. I enjoyed it slightly more than The Cruel Prince. I would say The Wicked King was more of like a 4.5, but I, again, couldn't quite round it up to 5. Can't pinpoint exactly why, but it feels more like a 4 than a 5. But I really enjoyed it, more than The Cruel Prince. And then the last book that I finished in the month of April was The Book of Koli by M.R. Carey. This is the first book in a trilogy, or what will be a trilogy, called the Rampart Trilogy. I did read an e-ARC, or an e-advanced reader copy of this that I got from NetGalley, but this book has been released at this point, so you can go buy it if you want. This is an adult book, actually, and it's a science fiction that is post-apocalyptic. I was really excited to read this book because I absolutely love The Girl Without the Gifts duology by M.R. Carey that I read a couple of years ago, and so I was excited to read something else by this author, especially considering it was a post-apocalyptic fiction, because I love post-apocalyptic fiction. So in this world, this is set in our very far future, but plants have kind of evolved to enjoy the taste of flesh. And so people and society has kind of regressed, and now we live in these like little villages that are protected by these big walls to keep plants out. And the world is just a much more dangerous place. So the main character in this book is named Koli. He's about 17, and he lives in this village called Mythen Rood. He's never left this village before in his life, but after some things happen, he is kind of forced to leave this little village, and the story goes from there. One thing that kind of surprised me about this book is that the main character is pretty young, 17, and the themes in the story kind of fit really well with YA, but it definitely felt more like an adult book, and Orbit really doesn't publish YA, so I do think it is marketed as an adult book, but I think this would be a really good like YA adult crossover book because there were things about it that reminded me of a YA book. I also really enjoy stories about like future but regressed sort of societies, and that was one of my favorite things about this book. There's actually a lot of like technology that is left over from the past, technology that has progressed more than like our present day technology, and a lot of those things are like weapons. Only a lot of this technology doesn't work anymore, but some of it responds to specific people, and if someone is able to wake up tech, then they become a rampart, who are basically the protectors of the village. So I really liked that technology piece. Before picking this up, I had seen someone say that this book reminded them of the video game Horizon Zero Dawn, which I happened to actually be playing at the time of reading this book, so that was really fun. Related to that technology, another thing that I really liked was there is actually an AI character in this book, obviously a remnant of the past in this world, but I really enjoyed that character, and I definitely think that if you like AI in books, then that's just one more reason to check this one out. One thing I do want to prepare people for is that this book is written in a little bit of a vernacular because English has changed over time, and the English that the characters use in this book and the English that it's written in isn't exactly our kind of English. There's a lot of like bad grammar, mostly the wrong tense sort of thing, but it was a little weird when I was first reading it. It took some getting used to because I would at first have to kind of translate what I was reading in my head into like normal English, but then once I got used to it, I didn't really notice and I didn't have that extra like having to translate in my head step. I just immediately knew what the book was saying. Really, my only complaint about this book is the pacing. It was a little slower than I was anticipating. It's definitely more of a character-focused story about Koli and seeing the things that happen to him. And then the other thing is that by the time you finish this book, it's very clear that this is just the beginning of Koli's adventure. It felt a little like it was just a setup for what's to come. And while the book does have its own plot and it does stand on its own, it doesn't stand on its own as much as I think I would like. At the same time, I'm very excited for the direction the story is taking. When the book ends, you have a very clear idea of what Koli is going to do next, and I think that the next book will really open up this world and also answer some of the world building questions that I don't feel like I got enough of. Some more information about how the trees became the way they did. There is a little bit of that, but not as much as I would like. And I think that we'll learn more in the next book, which I am really excited about. All right, guys, those are the 7 books that I read in the month of April. So if you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them down in the comment section, or let me know if you want to read them. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye. And also, again, I'll have the vlogs listed down below. And again, and also, like I said, like I mentioned, the first one that I read and finished was, and that obviously lines up really well with the Horizon Zero Dawn. What am I trying to say? Horizon Zero Dawn. All right, guys, those are the 8. Bye.